Galactic Council laughed at humans until the fleet arrived. Part 1: The Day They Laughed. The laughter hit me before the translation chip in my ear had even finished processing the words. 500 alien representatives, 500 different species, 500 different sets of vocal cords, lungs, and sound-producing organs, and every single one of them found a way to laugh at the same moment. It rolled through the grand amphitheater of the Galactic Conclave like a wave, loud and layered, bouncing off walls so tall that clouds formed near the ceiling. Real clouds. I had been warned about that. The building was so enormous that weather happened inside it. I stood at the podium, alone. My name is HFY. I am 34 years old. I have a degree in xenodiplomacy from the University of Edinburgh and a scar on my left hand from a climbing accident when I was 19. I mention these things because the beings laughing at me did not know any of them. To the Galactic Council, I was not a person. I was a representative of a species that had wandered into the wrong room. I kept my hands flat on the podium. I did not look away. I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. I had studied council protocol, learned to read the posture of 7 different species, practiced my speech in Galactic Standard until I dreamed in it. I had memorized the membership criteria, the voting procedure, the historical precedents. I had done everything right. It did not matter. The Vorathi ambassador had spoken before I could finish my second sentence. His name was Councillor Vreth, and he was tall, nearly 3 meters, with a pale blue exoskeleton that caught the chamber's light like polished bone. He had interrupted me with a raised appendage, which in Vorathi culture was the equivalent of a dismissive wave. His translator chip rendered his words into flat, precise English, which was the language of record for this session. "The delegate from Earth," he had said, and paused to let the title sit in the air like a bad smell, "has stated that her species deserves full council membership on the basis of cultural development, technological capacity, and I want to make sure I have this correct, a quote, demonstrated commitment to peace." He had turned to the chamber then, slowly, making sure everyone was watching. "A species that has been engaged in organized conflict among its own population for 90% of its recorded history," he said, "is presenting itself as a committed partner in galactic peace." That was when the laughter started. It did not sting the way people might imagine. It did not make me feel small or frightened. What it did was clarify something for me, something I had half suspected but not fully confirmed until that moment. They had not read our file. Not really. They had skimmed the summary. They had seen the wars and stopped reading. They had never looked at what came after the wars. They had never looked at what we built while we were fighting. I waited for the laughter to thin. It took almost 90 seconds. I counted. When the chamber quieted enough for my voice to carry, I spoke. "Councillor Vreth is correct," I said. "Humanity has a long history of conflict. We do not hide this. We include it in our application because we believe honest disclosure is more valuable than a polished record." Vreth tilted his head. It was not a gesture of curiosity. It was the Vorathi equivalent of rolling one's eyes. "The application," he said, "has been reviewed by the membership committee. The committee's recommendation is as follows." He produced a flat screen from somewhere beneath his robe and read from it in a tone that was almost bored. "Earth's application for full Galactic Council membership is declined on the grounds of insufficient interstellar presence, unresolved internal conflicts, and a military doctrine classified as, and I quote, dangerously unstructured." He set the screen down. "There is also a note," he added, and his mandibles shifted in a way the translation chip did not render, but which I recognized from my studies as a smile, suggesting that Earth may reapply in 200 years, when its species has had sufficient time to mature. The laughter came again, louder this time. I looked out at those 500 faces, the long and the flat, the scaled and the furred, the ones with too many eyes and the ones with none, and I did something that I had planned very carefully in advance. I smiled. Not a polite smile, not a nervous smile, the kind of smile that means, I know something you do not. Then I bowed, a single deliberate bow. Then I turned and walked out of the grand amphitheater of the Galactic Conclave, and I did not look back, and I did not hurry, and I counted my steps because counting kept my breathing even. Behind me, the laughter continued. I walked through the corridor that led to the visitor docking bay. The walls were made of a material that showed the stars outside live in real time. I could see the black between the systems. I could see the nothing. My ship was waiting. It was a small diplomatic vessel, single crew, Earth-built, with a jump drive that the Council's docking officials had politely but firmly assessed as primitive. One of them had actually said that to my face while completing my entry paperwork. I had thanked him. I boarded the ship. I sealed the hatch. I sat down in the pilot's seat and pulled up my communication log. There was a message from Director Harlan Webb, waiting. Webb was the man who had sent me here. He was 62 years old, quiet, and absolutely ruthless in the way that only patient people can be. The message was short, as his messages always were. He had sent it before my session, with the council had even begun. It said, if the vote goes wrong, come straight home. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone, just come home. I read it twice. Then I pulled up the secondary display, the one that showed sensor data from the space around the conclave. I looked at it for a long moment. I looked at what was not there, at the readings that were absent, at the signatures that should have shown up and did not. The council chamber was still full of laughter. None of them were looking at their sensors. I set a course for Earth and engaged the drive. They watched me leave. None of them looked at the sensors. Part 2, what they never bothered to study. Ship's personal log, day 4 of transit. I am talking to myself again, which is something I have done since childhood and which my mother always said was a sign of either genius or loneliness. Given current circumstances, I suspect it is both. My name is HFY. I have just been laughed out of the most powerful political body in the known galaxy. I am flying home at maximum speed because my director told me to, and because I do not want to be in that part of space any longer than necessary. And I am recording this log because I need to think out loud, and there is no one else here to listen. Let me tell you what the Galactic Council does not know about us. I mean that seriously. I want to lay it out, step by step, the way you would explain something to someone who has made a very large and very consequential mistake. Because they have. They just do not know it yet. The Council's intelligence report on Earth was 31 years old. I found this out during the pre-session briefing, when a Thalari aide, polite, young, clearly uncomfortable, handed me a printed summary and quietly mentioned that the most recent data had been gathered during a survey mission in 2073. I am writing this in 2104. I did the math in my head while he was still talking. 31 years. The Council had not updated their file on humanity in 31 years, because updating it had never seemed urgent enough to bother with. Think about what that means. 31 years ago, Earth had 14 functioning interstellar vessels. 14. We were proud of them. They were slow, expensive, and named after ancient sea explorers because someone in the naming committee had a sense of poetry. The Council looked at those 14 ships, calculated our expansion rate, and concluded that Earth would remain a minor presence in the galaxy for at least 2 centuries. That was a reasonable conclusion. In 2073. What happened after 2073 is the part they did not read. In 2075, the Nakamura drive was completed, not the prototype, the production model, the one that reduced jump time by a factor of 9. The Council's sensors picked up the energy signature and logged it as increased civilian research activity. They were not wrong, technically. The Nakamura drive was developed by a civilian research team at a university in Osaka. What the report failed to note was that the same team had been receiving funding from 8 different national defense agencies simultaneously, and that the moment the drive was completed, those agencies had very specific plans for what to do with it. In 2078, the quiet yards were opened. I need to explain the quiet yards because they are important, and because they are the thing that nobody outside of a very small number of people on Earth even knew existed. They are located on the dark side of Jupiter, not hidden, exactly, but positioned in such a way that they face away from any direction the Council's survey drones typically approached from. They were not secret because we were afraid of being caught. They were not secret because we were doing something wrong. They were quiet because humans, when we are building something we are very serious about, do not make announcements. We make plans. Then we execute the plans. Then we show people what we made. I grew up knowing nothing about the quiet yards. My father worked in logistics and my mother was a teacher, and neither of them had any connection to the program. Most people on Earth did not. The quiet yards employed about 40,000 people directly, and each of those 40,000 had signed agreements that were enforced with the kind of legal weight that made people very careful about what they said at dinner parties. What I know now, because Director Webb told me before I left for the council session, is that the quiet yards have been operational for 26 years. I know what they have been building. I know how many. I know the names, because the naming committee for this program had the same sense of poetry as the one that named the early survey ships, except this time, instead of sea explorers, they used battles. Every ship is named after a battle that humans lost. I thought about that for a long time when Webb told me. It seemed like an odd choice. You might expect a military program of this scale to name its vessels after victories, after the moments of triumph, the turning points, the great heroic stands. But no, every ship in that fleet carries the name of a defeat, a retreat, a last stand that did not hold. When I asked Webb why, he thought about it for a moment and then said, "Because we remember them, and because remembering them is why we built this." I did not fully understand that at the time. I think I do now. The Vorathi ambassador stood in front of 500 representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations and told them that humanity had been at war with itself for 90% of its recorded history. He meant it as an insult. He meant it to provoke laughter, and it did. What he did not understand, what none of them understood, is that 90% of our recorded history spent at war is not a mark of barbarism. It is a curriculum. It is 10,000 years of applied research into how to move forces, how to supply them, how to maintain morale under pressure, how to adapt tactics when the situation changes, how to absorb catastrophic losses and continue functioning, how to build faster than the enemy can destroy. The galaxy has had peace for so long that its members have forgotten what organisms shaped by war actually look like. They looked at us and saw a species that had not yet grown up. They did not look closely enough to notice that we had already survived everything. Every disease, every collapse, every catastrophe that should have ended us, we came through it. And every time we came through it, we built something stronger on the other side. Not because we are special, not because we are chosen. Because we are stubborn in a way that borders on unreasonable. And because we have had 10,000 years of practice at surviving things that should have finished us. I pulled up the footage from the council chamber on my ship's display. I had been recording it on a private channel from the moment the session began, because I had been told to document everything. I scrubbed through the recording until I found the moment Vreth interrupted me. I watched his mandibles shift into that shape I recognized as amusement. I marked the timestamp. I made a note next to it which said, "He will remember this differently." I do not say that with anger. I say it with the kind of calm certainty that comes from knowing something the other person does not yet know. It is not satisfaction exactly. It is something quieter than that. On the secondary display, I pulled up a map of human space. The real one, not the one in the council's 31-year-old file. The one that showed where we actually were now. The one with all the installations and outposts and relay stations, and in the region near Jupiter, a cluster of signals that were not labeled on any public chart. I looked at it for a while. Then I looked at the message from Director Webb again. Just come home. I had been chosen for this mission because I am good at reading rooms and better at not reacting when I should not react. Webb had told me that directly in a meeting 6 months ago, when he explained exactly what the council session was and was not expected to accomplish. You are not going there to win a vote, he had said. You are going there to stand in that room, be dismissed, and come home with your dignity intact. The vote doesn't matter. Then what does? I had asked. He had looked at me with the expression of a man who has been carrying a very large secret for a very long time and has become accustomed to its weight. Time, he said. The vote buys us 6 more weeks. That's all we need. I had not asked what would happen in 6 weeks. I had not needed to. I turned off the display showing the council chamber. I turned off the footage of Vreth's amusement and the 500 voices laughing in a room with its own weather. I set the autopilot and leaned back in my seat and looked at the stars sliding past the viewport. 6 weeks. The universe is very old. Humans are very new to it, but new does not mean unprepared, and young does not mean weak. It means that we have had to fight for everything we have, from the very beginning, and that we have never once stopped building, not during the wars, not after them, not even when the rest of the galaxy decided we were not worth the time it would take to update a file. Somewhere behind me, the grand amphitheater of the Galactic Conclave was still full of laughter. Somewhere ahead of me, in the dark near Jupiter, 40,000 people were working the night shift. The stars moved past the viewport. I closed my eyes. Part 3. The Silence Before the Signal. I, Admiral Drev of the Vorathi 7th Expansion Fleet, have commanded warships for 40 years. I say this not to impress you. I say it because 40 years of command teaches a being certain instincts, a sense of the space around a vessel, a feeling for when something is wrong before the instruments confirm it. Old commanders talk about this in quiet moments after meals when the lights in the mess hall are low. They call it listening to the dark. Some believe it is superstition. I used to be among those who did. I am no longer among those who believe that. The session at the conclave had ended well, by any measure. The human delegate, a small female of the species, alone, without bodyguards or aides, had been processed through the membership committee and turned away without drama. I had delivered the committee's rejection personally, which was not required by protocol but which I had volunteered for, because the humans had been persistent in their application, and I wanted the dismissal to be unambiguous. She had smiled at me as she left. I had found that smile faintly irritating at the time. I had not found it alarming. That was my first mistake. 3 days after the session, my communications officer, a sharp young Vorathi named Lieutenant Krev, brought me a report from our border observation network. It was flagged as low priority, which is why it had taken 3 days to reach my desk. The report noted several unusual readings near the outer edge of the Terran system, mass signatures that did not correspond to any registered vessel class, moving in a direction consistent with deep space transit. I read the report. I noted that our observation network was not fully calibrated in that sector, which created a margin of error. I wrote sensor calibration error, log and monitor at the bottom of the report, signed it, and handed it back to Lieutenant Krev. That was my second mistake. On the 5th day after the session, I received a routine update from the Border Patrol fleet stationed in the outer marches, the buffer zone between Vorathi space and the edge of Terran territory. The update included a note that Patrol Vessel 7 had not filed its scheduled check-in communication. This was not unusual. Equipment failures happened. Crew scheduling errors happened. I authorized a standard follow-up inquiry and returned to my primary work, which was planning a border survey operation near a system we called the Marches Crossing, a line of 3 uninhabited planetary bodies that fell inside what Vorathi territorial mapping classified as our zone of influence, but which several Terran colony ships had been spotted near in recent years. We were not going to fire on anyone. This was a display operation, the kind of thing large fleets do to remind smaller powers of existing boundaries. We had done it a dozen times in the past century, and it had always been effective, because the species on the receiving end always ran the numbers and reached the correct conclusion. On the 7th day, Patrol Vessel 7 was still silent. On the 8th day, Patrol Vessel 4 also stopped responding. I stood in my command center and looked at the map of our border region and felt something I had not felt in a long time, not fear, not exactly, but a sharpening. The kind of sharpening that comes before fear, the way a drop in temperature comes before a storm. "Lieutenant Krev," I said. "Admiral, have we received any traffic from the Terran communication network in the past 48 hours?" Krev checked his instruments. He took a moment longer than expected, which told me the answer before he spoke it. "No, Admiral. Terran communication channels have been quiet. No diplomatic traffic, no commercial broadcasts, no emergency signals. Nothing. Nothing." I walked to the primary sensor station and stood behind the operator, a young Vorathi technician named Ven who had the good sense not to speak unless spoken to. I looked at the display myself. The border region appeared quiet. The 2 missing patrol vessels were marked with amber indicators, inactive, unknown status. The space around them showed nothing. "Run an active sweep," I said. "Active sweeps will reveal our position," Ven said. "I am aware of that. Run the sweep." The active sweep took 90 seconds to process and return data. It showed me the outer marches in clear detail, the planets, the dust clouds, the gravitational signatures of the local star. It showed me the spots where patrol vessels 4 and 7 were supposed to be. It showed me nothing in those spots, not wreckage, not debris, not emergency buoys, nothing. They had not been destroyed, they had been removed. I will tell you what that means because it took me a moment to understand it myself. When a ship is destroyed in space, it leaves evidence. Destroyed things create fragments. Even a vessel vaporized by an energy weapon leaves ionized residue. The sensor signature of destruction is unmistakable and it lingers. But when I looked at the coordinates where my patrol vessels should have been, I saw clean space, undisturbed space. Space that had not experienced any kind of energetic event in recent history. My ships had simply stopped being there. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Krev from across the room. His voice was carefully neutral, which among Vorathi is a sign of significant internal effort. "I am receiving a partial signal from the relay station at Marches Crossing." "Put it through." The relay station's automated signal was designed to report any large mass signatures entering its detection range. It was designed to be calm and informational. It transmitted in flat, coded pulses, one for each object detected. The signal coming through was not calm. It was rapid, continuous, so many pulses stacked together that Krev's terminal was having difficulty parsing them individually. "How many?" I asked. Krev looked at his screen. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Lieutenant, how many objects is the relay station reporting?" "It is still counting, Admiral," he said quietly. "The detection threshold was designed for standard traffic volumes. It appears to be overwhelmed." I looked at the main display. I looked at the map of the outer marches. I looked at the space between my fleet and the edge of Terran territory. I opened a communication channel to the Galactic Council's emergency line. This was a channel reserved for genuine crises, for things that required immediate collective attention. I had used it once in my 40-year career, during the Rithian border collapse of 2089. I had hoped not to use it again. "This is Admiral Drev of the Vorathi 7th Fleet," I said. "I am reporting a possible large-scale Terran military movement near the outer marches. I am requesting council assessment and possible mediation." The response came from a duty officer, not a counselor, just a junior administrator working the overnight shift at the conclave. His voice carried the particular tone of someone who has been woken from a comfortable routine by an inconvenient call. "Admiral Drev, can you confirm the nature of the threat?" "I cannot confirm the nature," I said. "I can confirm the scale." There was a pause. I could hear the duty officer pulling up something on his terminal. "Admiral," he said, and I could hear the effort he was making to remain professional. "Our records indicate that the Terran delegate was dismissed from a council session 11 days ago. Is it possible this is related to, I want to phrase this carefully, some kind of protest action? Perhaps a demonstration of." "Patrol Vessel 7 and Patrol Vessel 4 have been missing for 4 days, I said. "They did not broadcast distress signals. They did not send emergency messages. They simply ceased reporting. The relay station at March's Crossing is currently transmitting a mass detection signal that my communications officer cannot parse because there are too many objects for the station software to count individually. I do not believe this is a protest." Another pause. "I'll escalate the report," the duty officer said. I closed the channel. I stood in my command center and breathed through my nose in the slow, deliberate way my old training instructor had taught me. The technique for maintaining clear thought when the environment is not cooperating. The relay station signal was still coming through. Krev had managed to configure his terminal to display a running count. The number was not yet final. It was still climbing. "Admiral," said Ven from the sensor station. His voice was very quiet. "I'm reading something on the passive sensors, starboard side, very large, moving slowly." "A ship." "Multiple ships," Ven said. "Very large ones. They are not broadcasting identification." I walked to the starboard viewport. Viewports on military vessels are not for navigation. They are ceremonial, a tradition from an earlier era. But I walked to it anyway, because 40 years of command had taught me that sometimes you need to use your own eyes. I looked out at the stars. On the starboard side, between my vessel and the distant light of the system's star, I watched the stars go dark, one by one, not blinking out, not dying, simply being covered by something very large that was passing between me and them. The darkness spread, slowly, steadily. Something was out there, and it was blocking the stars with its size. "Ven," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt, "what is the estimated mass of the objects on our starboard side?" Ven worked his instruments for several seconds. When he answered, he did not look up from his screen. "The calculation is still processing, Admiral. The mass signature is larger than anything in our reference database. The computer is having difficulty classifying it because it does not have a comparable example." I kept looking out the viewport. The darkness kept spreading. The stars kept disappearing, one by one, in a long, slow arc from north to south along my starboard horizon. I thought about the human delegate standing at the podium in the grand amphitheater. I thought about 500 beings laughing at a single small woman with her hands flat on the podium, and her expression completely calm. I thought about the way she had smiled before she left. I reached for the communication panel and opened the all-fleet channel. "All vessels," I said, "go to full readiness. This is not a drill." Outside the viewport, the last star on my starboard side went dark. Part 4, the fleet arrives. I was sitting in the commander's chair of the UENS, Thermopylae, when the clock hit 0. The Thermopylae is the largest ship I have ever been on. It is also, as of 18 months ago, the largest ship ever constructed by human beings. It is 4 kilometers long and weighs more than some small moons. Its hull is made of an alloy that does not have a common name because it did not exist until 7 years ago when the materials team at the Quiet Yards invented it specifically for this program. The ship was named after a mountain pass in ancient Greece, where a small group of soldiers held back an army so large it took 3 days to walk past. They did not survive the battle. But the battle bought enough time for everything that came after. Director Webb chose the name personally. I had boarded the Thermopylae 6 weeks ago, 3 days after returning from the conclave. Webb had met me at the airlock. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, not the synthesized kind, and he handed me one without a word. We had walked to the bridge together. I had seen the fleet from space, through the ship's external cameras, as we pulled away from Jupiter's shadow. I want to try to describe what it looked like, but I am not sure I have the right words. Imagine a city. Now give the city engines. Now multiply the city by 4,000 and spread them across the dark between the planets in a formation so precise it looks drawn rather than arranged. The ships were different sizes and shapes, some long and narrow, built for speed, some wide and heavy, built for endurance, but they all moved together with the kind of synchronization that only comes from years of coordinated exercises in the same deep space conditions. 4,012 vessels. That was the final count, each one named after a battle, each one crewed by people who had trained for between 4 and 12 years for a mission that most of them had never been told the full details of until 48 hours before departure. When they were told, there was no drama, no speeches. The crew of the Thermopylae sat in the briefing hall and listened to me explain where we were going and why. When I finished, there were questions, practical ones, about logistics and fuel and communication protocols. Nobody fainted. Nobody refused. One engineer raised his hand and asked whether he would be able to send a message to his family before we left. I told him yes. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook, and that was the end of the meeting. That is the thing about people who have been training seriously for years. They do not panic at the news they have been training for. They get quiet. They get focused. They check their equipment and they send messages to their families and they show up on time. We arrived at the coordinates of the Galactic Council emergency session at 09:14 station time on a Tuesday, which felt like the sort of ordinary detail that belonged in a different kind of story. The Council had called the emergency session 2 days earlier, in response to Admiral Drev's communication. The session was being held in the secondary chamber of the conclave, smaller than the grand amphitheater, but still large enough to hold 300 representatives, which was roughly how many had managed to assemble on short notice. The session was supposed to be discussing what one counselor had referred to in a pre-meeting statement as the human problem. I had read that phrase on an intercepted diplomatic brief while we were in transit. The human problem. I had shared it with the crew of the Thermopylae. The response had been, collectively, a very dry silence followed by someone in the back of the room saying, "Let's show them the problem," and then everyone getting back to work. We dropped out of dark transit in a staggered sequence, not all at once, which would have been dramatic, but in groups of 40, spread across a span of 8 minutes, which was actually more effective because it meant the Council's sensors had time to count us. Each new group of ships appearing on their screens was a new confirmation that the number was real and was still growing. By the time the last ships arrived, the Council chamber had been completely silent for 4 minutes. I opened a hail to the full Council on the open frequency. Every ship in my fleet would hear it. Every vessel in Vorathi space with a communication receiver would hear it. I had written my statement during the transit and revised it 11 times. I delivered it in Galactic Standard. "Members of the Galactic Council," I said. "My name is Commander HFY, representing the United Earth Nations Space Command. We are not here to begin a conflict. We are not here with threats or ultimatums. We are here because it is important that this Council understand, clearly and without ambiguity, what a conflict with humanity would require. I paused for 3 seconds. I had planned the pause. The fleet you are currently reading on your sensors represents 22 years of continuous construction. It is fully operational. It is fully crewed. Every vessel carries a name from our history, a battle that we lost, because we believe it is important to remember the cost of being unprepared. Another pause. We would like this to be a conversation. The response from the council chamber took 47 seconds to arrive, which was approximately 40 seconds longer than it would normally take for a duty administrator to patch through a communication. That 47-second gap represented, I believed, a very significant amount of internal debate happening in a very short period of time. When the response came, it was Councillor Vreth. His voice was different from the one I remembered in the grand amphitheater. The amusement was gone. Something else had replaced it, not fear exactly, but a careful, controlled quality, the voice of someone measuring every word. "Commander Reyes," he said, "the Council acknowledges your communication. We request that your fleet maintain its current position and refrain from any aggressive movement while we assess the situation." "Of course," I said, "we have no plans to move. We are happy to wait." There was another pause on his end. "The Council will need time to." "We understand," I said. "Take all the time you need. We are very patient." I closed the hail. In the next 6 hours, we received 42 separate communication requests from Vorathi Military Command, 3 from the Thalari Diplomatic Corps, 1 from a being whose species I did not immediately recognize, who introduced himself as a freelance Galactic journalist and asked if I had a few minutes for an interview, and a brief, formal message from a Council junior administrator who asked whether our fleet required any supply provisions during our wait. I replied to the journalist that now was not the right time. I replied to the supply administrator that we were self-sufficient for the foreseeable future, which was the most diplomatic way I could think of to say that we had brought enough supplies for 2 years and had no intention of needing the Council's help for anything. On the 8th hour, I received a communication from Captain Owen Burke, commanding the destroyer EDS Chasen, a small, fast ship that had been positioned 20,000 kilometers ahead of the main fleet as a forward observer. "Commander," Burke said, his voice flat and precise, "the Vorathi have a military group in Sector 12 that is getting very talkative. They are requesting we withdraw from the current position." "Tell them we have received their request," I said. "Should I say we'll comply?" "No, just tell them we received it." Burke was quiet for a moment. "Understood." 3 hours after that, the Vorathi military commander, a different admiral from Drev, one who had been hastily appointed to represent their fleet in negotiations, formally requested that Earth's fleet demonstrate its intentions by reducing its forward posture. He phrased it carefully. He called it a gesture of mutual restraint. I called a brief meeting with my senior officers. We discussed the request for approximately 4 minutes. Then I had Captain Burke relay a counter-proposal to the Vorathi commander. The counter-proposal was this: Earth would demonstrate its intentions through a technical display rather than a withdrawal. We would demonstrate specifically the range and precision of the fleet's primary weapons systems. We would select a target that posed no risk to any living being, an uninhabited body, fully confirmed dead, of negligible scientific value. We would conduct one demonstration of approximately 30 seconds. Then we would open the conversation about membership. The Vorathi commander asked for clarification on what we meant by primary weapons systems. I had Burke tell him that he would find out shortly. I signaled Captain Priya Collins of the EDS Imjin River and Captain Nathan Shore of the EDS Key San. Both vessels were destroyers, not the largest ships in the fleet, but among the best armed. I had chosen them specifically because they were not the biggest. I wanted the Council to understand that what they were about to see was not the fleet's maximum capacity. It was an average demonstration. The target was a small rocky body in the outer system, catalogued, confirmed lifeless, roughly 7 kilometers across. It had been selected and confirmed during mission planning 4 months earlier. Collins and Shore had 11 seconds to perform the engagement. They used 9. What had been a 7-kilometer rock became, in 9 seconds, a spreading cloud of superheated particles that glowed briefly in the sensor display like a new star being born, and then faded into the dark. I watched the feed on my secondary display. Then I watched the council chamber feed. The chamber was completely silent. 300 representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species sat in absolute stillness and stared at their screens. I let them sit with it for 1 full minute. I had planned this too. Then I opened the hail again. The council may have noticed that the demonstration involved 2 destroyers, I said, keeping my voice even. We have 267 destroyers in this fleet. We also have other vessel classifications, but I want to be careful not to overwhelm the meeting agenda. I let that sit for a moment. Earth's membership application was filed 3 years ago, I said. The documentation is complete. The references are in order. We believe the committee has had sufficient time to review our materials. I paused for exactly 3 seconds. We would like a revote. Part 5, a seat at the table. 6 weeks. That was how long it took. 6 weeks from the day the Thermopylae dropped out of dark transit outside the Conclave station to the day I walked back into the grand amphitheater of the Galactic Council and took a seat at the long curved table that circled the chamber floor. Not at the podium this time. At the table. In the chair that had been officially designated as Earth's seat by a vote that, when it was finally called, was unanimous. Let me tell you about those 6 weeks, because they were not simple and they were not quiet, and because the story of how the vote was won matters more than the vote itself. The night after the demonstration, I received a message from Director Webb. It was longer than his usual messages. He said that the response from Earth's government had been positive, that the news had reached the public, and that people in cities around the world had gone outside in large numbers to look up at the sky. He did not say they were celebrating. He said they were looking up. I thought about that for a while after I finished reading. The Vorathi were the first to move. Not militarily, their military had done a thorough assessment of the situation and reached the same conclusion that any military reaches when it looks at a force it cannot match. They went quiet. The communications from their command center slowed and then stopped. The admiral who had asked about our intentions withdrew from the open channel. In their place, 3 days after the demonstration, I received a formal communication from a Vorathi diplomatic office I had never heard of, staffed by people who spoke very carefully and asked very reasonable questions about Earth's long-term intentions regarding territorial boundaries. I had a team of 6 diplomats with me on the Thermopylae. They had been there since we left Jupiter, working out of a converted storage bay that had been turned into a conference room. They were very good. I put them on the Vorathi channel and told them to be thorough and unhurried. The Thalari were more interesting. The Thalari counselor, a being named Sauron, whose species communicated partly through color shifts in their translucent outer skin, had been one of the few members of the council who had not laughed during my original session. I had noticed this at the time and filed it. 3 days after my return to the council's communication network, I received a private message from Sauron, addressed to me personally, not to the fleet or to Earth's diplomatic office. The message said, "I would like to speak with you without an official record. Is that possible?" I replied that it was. We spoke the following morning, through a secondary channel that ran through a relay point I had set up specifically for conversations that I wanted kept off the primary log. Sauron was, I discovered, approximately 90 years old by human counting, which was young for a Thalari. He had been a counselor for only 11 years, and had spent most of those 11 years reading the history of species that had been dismissed from the council chamber before they were ready. He had a long list of them. "There is a pattern," he told me. "The council dismisses species it finds inconvenient, not dangerous, inconvenient. Species that ask complicated questions. Species that don't fit neatly into the existing structures. Usually those species accept the dismissal and go away." "Usually," I said. "You did not go away," he said. "No. I want to ask you something honestly," he said, "and I would like an honest answer." "I'll do my best. When you walked out of this chamber the first time," he said, "did you know the fleet was already moving?" I looked at him through the camera feed. His skin was doing something quiet and blue around the edges. "Yes," I said. "How long had it been planned?" "The fleet has been in preparation for 22 years, I said. "The diplomatic mission to the council was planned in coordination with the fleet's deployment schedule. My appearance at the session was, among other things, a timing mechanism." Soren was quiet for a moment. His skin shifted color slowly, moving through a range I did not know well enough to read. "You were never trying to win the vote that day," he said. "No, I was buying 6 weeks. For the fleet to reach its position." "Yes." Another pause. "That," said Soren, "is the most sophisticated piece of political strategy I have seen in my 11 years on this council." I thanked him. He told me he would support the membership application and would speak privately with 4 other councilors he believed could be moved. He asked for nothing in return, which surprised me. When I said as much, he said, "I'm not doing this for Earth. I am doing this because a council that laughs at species it has not bothered to understand is a council that will eventually make a mistake it cannot recover from. Having Earth at the table makes this council less likely to make that mistake." That was the most useful thing anyone said to me during those 6 weeks. The formal negotiation process took the rest of the time. My diplomatic team handled most of it, working through the procedural requirements that the council's membership protocol demanded. There were documents to file, hearings to attend, subcommittee reviews to navigate. I sat in on some of them. I sent team members to the rest. The fleet remained in position throughout, unhurried, maintaining its coordinates with the kind of patient steadiness that very large, very well-supplied military forces can maintain indefinitely. No one asked us to move again after the 3rd week. Councillor Vreth did not participate in the formal process. His office submitted a written statement that supported the membership application, which was required by the voting procedure once a motion reached the floor. The statement was brief and contained no direct reference to the events of the past 6 weeks. I read it once, noted its absence of any personal tone, and moved on. On the day of the vote, the grand amphitheater was full. Not the 300 who had assembled for the emergency session, the full 500, every seat occupied. I did not know if they had come because the vote was important or because they wanted to see what would happen. Both motivations would have produced the same result, so it did not matter. I sat at the table this time, not at the podium. The vote was conducted by the council's administrator, a small, quiet being whose species I had not previously encountered, who managed the procedural elements of the session with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times and found the drama entirely beside the point. Each member recorded their vote through their terminal. The results were displayed on the central column that rose from the middle of the table. Unanimous. All 500 in favor. The chamber was quiet after the result was displayed. Not the silence of shock, the silence of something settling into place. I sat at the table and looked at the central column and thought about the first time I had stood at the podium in this room, with 500 beings laughing at me, and how I had counted my steps on the way out because counting kept my breathing even. A young Thalari delegate, not Soren, someone younger, came to find me after the formal session ended. She was junior, clearly, still learning the protocols, but she had the directness of someone who had decided to ask the question before she thought too hard about whether she should. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "We always assumed," she said carefully, "that a civilization builds itself first, its culture, its infrastructure, its presence, and then builds its defense capability as it expands. That is the standard model. The Council uses it to assess new species." "I know," I said. "Your species did not follow that model," she said. "You built both at the same time, for decades, in secret." She paused. "When did it start? The real program, not the diplomatic one." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Director Webb and the quiet yards and 40,000 people who had worked for 26 years without making announcements. I thought about the ships named after battles that were lost. "When did it start?" I said, more to myself than to her. I looked at the empty chamber around us, the vast space, the seats that had been full an hour ago, the ceiling so high that clouds formed near it. "I think," I said, "it started the first time someone looked down at us and laughed." She considered this. "That is a very long time to be patient," she said. "Yes," I agreed, "we are good at it." She thanked me and left. I sat at the table alone for a while after that. The chamber staff were moving around the edges of the room, resetting terminals, collecting documents. No one spoke to me. I was glad of the quiet. A message arrived from the Thermopylae. From Captain Burke, not Webb. Webb's messages came through the diplomatic channel and took longer to route. Burke's came direct, command channel, which meant it was related to fleet operations. I opened it. It was 3 words. "Keep the fleet warm." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, just to confirm that it really was only 3 words, and that those 3 words meant exactly what they appeared to mean, and that Webb had decided the fleet's current position was one worth maintaining, and that there was no follow-up memo, no policy explanation, no accompanying documentation, just 3 words delivered through the fastest communication channel available. I thought about the Vorathi diplomatic team that my people were still talking to. I thought about the 300 representatives who had sat in the emergency chamber watching a 7-kilometer rock become light and heat in 9 seconds. I thought about Soren and his quiet blue skin, and his 11 years of watching the Council dismiss species it found inconvenient. I thought about the 500 seats in the amphitheater that had, 1 hour ago, all registered the same answer. And I thought about how the universe is a very large place with a very long memory, and about how the beings in it have a tendency to judge newcomers by the smallest version of themselves they can find, and about how sometimes the best response to that is not an argument or a protest or even a fleet, but simply the willingness to wait until the moment is exactly right. I put my hand flat on the table, the same way I had put my hands flat on the podium the first time I stood in this room, and I felt the solid weight of it, the physical fact of a chair that now belonged to us at a table we had earned the right to sit at. I sent a reply to Burke. 2 words. Already done. Then I looked out across the empty amphitheater, 500 seats, clouds near the ceiling, light coming through panels that had been designed to mimic the look of open sky. And I permitted myself one moment of something I had been careful not to show for 6 weeks, something that had no translation in Galactic standard and no diplomatic use at all. I laughed just once, but I made sure no one was watching.